The Galactic Council had seen many strange alliances in its 3,000-year history, but none quite like the treaty signed on that rain-soaked evening aboard the diplomatic vessel Concordia. Alpha Kivarn of the Thraxian sovereignty stood before Commander Jalen Ward, his fur bristling with what humans had learned to recognize as profound anxiety. "You understand what I ask of you?" Kivarn's translator rendered his growling speech into flat, emotionless standard, but his amber eyes told a different story, one of desperation. Jalen nodded slowly. Behind the Alpha stood 3 juveniles barely past their first molt. The eldest Arthar met Jalen's gaze with unsettling intensity for one so young. "The Scourge won't wait for them to come of age. You need warriors now, and they need time to grow. Time we do not have." Kivarn placed a clawed hand on Arthar's shoulder. "But humans are different. You raise your young through stories of impossible victories. You teach them to see challenges as invitations rather than barriers." Jalen had heard this speech before, in a dozen different forms, from a dozen different species. Humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat had become something of a legend in the 70 years since first contact. They called it madness. They called it inspiration. Mostly they called it terrifying. "I'll train them," Jalen said. "But I train them the human way. No shortcuts. No gentle path." Kivarn's translator clicked with what might have been a laugh. "Commander, my people have clawed our way to dominance on a world where everything wants to kill you. We do not fear your methods." How wrong he was. The human training compound on Kepler 442b was not designed for comfort. Jalen had chosen the location specifically. A world with 1.3 g gravity, thin atmosphere, and weather patterns that could shift from scorching heat to freezing storms within hours. Again. Jalen's voice cut through the howling wind as Arthar struggled to maintain his firing position. The Thraxian youth's limbs trembled, his weapon wavering despite his best efforts. "I cannot," Arthar gasped. "Then you die." Jalen's words were cold, but his hand on Arthar's shoulder was steady. "Not cannot. Say I have not yet figured out how." Rathar's eyes widened. In Thraxian culture, admitting limitation was admitting defeat. But this human was asking him to acknowledge difficulty, while simultaneously refusing to surrender to it. The paradox made his head spin. "I have not yet figured out how," Arthar repeated slowly. "Good. Now let's figure it out together." Months became years. The 3 cubs, Rathar, Skara, and young Viren, absorbed human training doctrine like sponges absorbing water. They learned to run when their legs screamed for rest. They learned to think when exhaustion demanded they simply react. They learned that failure was not shameful. It was data. But more than tactics and conditioning, they learned human stories. Jalen would gather them after training, when Kepler 442b's twin moons rose in the alien sky, and he would tell them of Thermopylae and the Alamo, of Dunkirk and the siege of Leningrad. Stories where vastly outnumbered humans stood against impossible odds and even in defeat, wrote their names across history in defiant letters. "We do not fight to win," Jalen explained one evening, as Arthar dressed a wound from that day's combat exercise. "We fight because the fight itself matters. We fight because surrender is a choice and we choose differently." Rathar's translator couldn't properly render the rumbling sound he made, but Jalen had learned to recognize Thraxian understanding. "You teach us to be apex predators of the spirit, not just the body." "I teach you to be human," Jalen corrected. "And humans don't quit." 5 years after Kivarn had left his cubs in human care, the Thraxian sovereignty had pushed the Scourge back to a stalemate. The Alpha's desperate gambit, committing his entire adult population to an all-or-nothing defensive war, had bought time. Barely, Kivarn's flagship entered orbit around Kepler 442b with a request for final respects. The cubs he had left behind would be nearly mature now, old enough to receive their death names before being sent to die gloriously against the Scourge. As was tradition, what Kivarn found instead would echo through the galaxy for generations. The delegation materialized in the compound's parade ground to find not 3 cubs, but 300 warriors standing in perfect formation. At their head stood Rathar, now towering and battle-scarred, wearing armor that blended Thraxian design with human engineering. Behind him, Skara and Viren commanded wings of their own. Humans, Thraxians, and a dozen other species, all bearing the insignia of the new hybrid legion. Father, Rathar's voice no longer needed translation. He had learned standard Mandarin and Arabic. He had learned to speak the languages of Earth, the planet whose children refused to recognize the word impossible. We are ready. Kavarn's translator failed to capture the emotion in his voice. Ready? You are cubs still? We are cubs no longer, Sakara interrupted, her tone respectful but firm. Commander Ward taught us that age is not what makes a warrior. Choice is. Jalen stepped forward, his gray hair and weathered face showing the passage of those 5 years more clearly than the Thoraxian's ageless features. Alpha Kavarn, your cubs came to me as children. They return to you as what we call force multipliers. Each of them can train 10 more. Those 10 can train 100. They don't just command a legion, they are a seed from which an army will grow. Varen, the youngest, spoke with quiet confidence that belied his years. The Scourge believes victory is inevitable. Commander Ward taught us that humans once believed heavier-than-air flight was impossible, that breaking the sound barrier would kill a pilot, that their world was the center of the universe. They were wrong about all of it. Rathar stepped forward, meeting his father's gaze. You left us with humans because humans are crazy enough to fight when they should flee, to laugh when they should fear, to hope when they should despair. We learned their madness, Father, and now we will teach the Scourge what it means to face an enemy who simply refuses to lose. Kavarn looked at his children, no longer cubs, but hardened commanders radiating a peculiar mixture of Thoraxian ferocity and human audacity, and felt something he had not felt in 5 years. Hope. Then let us return home, the Alpha said, and let the Scourge learn to fear the sound of human-trained warriors singing their battle songs. As the hybrid legion boarded the transport ships, Jalen watched from the parade ground. A young human lieutenant approached him. Sir, do you think they can win? Jalen smiled, remembering a young Thoraxian cub trembling in the wind. Learning to transform I cannot into I have not yet figured out how, Lieutenant. I taught them the most important human military doctrine ever devised. We don't fight to win. We fight until we win. There's a difference. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to the struggles of the species below. But among those stars, a message was spreading, carried by those who had learned humanity's most dangerous export. Not weapons. Not technology, but the simple, stubborn, magnificent human refusal to give up.